Hello. We'll be starting shortly with our talk with Paula Caballero. Okay. Hey there. So we're just setting up the video and the audio and all of that. So let me just tell her you can join. Um, okay. Okay. And all right. So I'll run shortly in about 9 minutes the intro video. My apologies that we've had to shift from Run the World platform to this, but we had some technical difficulties, but this should be fine also. Let me just see. So we have one person already in. That's great. Let's see. Okay. And we'll get started shortly. As soon as Paula is able to join, I'll run the short intro video. Okay. Let's see. Let's see. There we go. All right. And if you have questions or comments or chat, just put it in the chat area. And I will take those questions as we move forward. We will finish exactly at 3. Paula is at a conference in New York at the United Nations. So where I'm quite cognizant of her time schedule. Okay. Mm-hmm. And we will be, as we're moving forward, we'll probably be doing more of these talks on the Mighty Network because of a little bit more flexibility, although it doesn't have the kind of matchmaking system that Run the World had, but hopefully that will be added in the future. But it gives a lot more flexibility. It's a lot easier for us to set up on the fly without too much preparation, and it's easier for us to invite people. So why is she not coming? All right, I'll just wait a little bit more, and we will run the share screen, and then we'll start that. Everybody seems to come at the very last minute, but thank you all for coming. Another 6 minutes, and we shall get started. Okay. Hello, Valeria. Here we go. Hope that this works. All right, there we go. Hello, Paula.
Hi, is it working?
I can hear you well. I can't see any camera. I think maybe the camera was not set up properly, but I hear you very well.
Oh no. I just checked my Zoom and the camera was working fine. What do I need to do here?
You see the little cogwheel at the bottom for settings?
Yes, I
Click
do.
on that
Yes.
and then choose the camera from your desktop. So at the moment you probably choose Zoom, which is working only for the Zoom platform. So you need to choose whatever your desktop camera is, which I don't know if you have a MacBook or you have a Windows.
I have an Lenovo. My camera is working fine.
Okay, but if you click on settings, do you see choices of cameras?
No. Let me see. It says customize profiles, privacy, appearance, systems reset, phone and other devices. Microsoft. No, it's giving me things about Microsoft Edge. Actually,
well, if you click on the cogwheel and you see on the settings, you should see a camera with a pull-down menu of different cameras that you can choose. You see the little cogwheel? If you move your cursor over settings, it's right underneath at the bottom. You'll see a microphone.
Yes, I do. But when I click on that, what it turns into is settings for Edge, for Microsoft Edge.
Okay, but you should be able to choose a different camera, can't you?
Well, let me search camera. Okay, so it says set permissions. No, my God.
Yeah, well, if not, we'll just do it with the audio. For some reason, it's not really allowing the camera to be seen for some weird reason.
It says it's on. It's not blocked for anything. And it says allow for you. It says allow.
All right. Well, we'll just have to manage as we are. We'll just do it with the audio. I'm sorry about that.
Yes, I'm sorry too.
So I'm going to just start in about 1 minute, an intro video that kind of explains everything, and then we'll.
Oh, there we go.
Hey, there we go. Hey, hello.
Wonderful. Okay, that's very good.
Next. Okay, so when I run this short introductory video, which explains, just mute your mic so there's no echo in the background. You see the little microphone underneath you. Just click on that for mute, and you can also this way you don't have an echo here. I'll run that in about 1 minute. And then I'll explain to everyone how the system works, and then make a short introduction to you. And then it'll be, the replay will be available probably a few minutes after the hour. So we'll stick to the 60 minutes. And I really appreciate you doing this during a very hectic conference with many, many speakers. So thank you so much for doing this. Oh, you're on. Oh, you're on mute. That's okay. That's okay.
I wasn't programmed to be here. It just turned out, and now I'm in 5 events today. So it.
Well, you're popular. So I'm going to run this video now. This just share screen. So during that time, just mute your mic. Welcome to Shareholders of a Better World, brought to you by TBLI Group. At TBLI Group, we have an established reputation as an organization dedicated to building the ecosystem of global sustainability and impact investing. We're doing this through educating, advising, and facilitating transactions in global sustainability and impact business, as well as capital solutions for private companies, family offices, and fund groups. For nearly 25 years, TBLI Group has created a vertically integrated ecosystem of education to action through TBLI conferences and TBLI consulting. More about our company can be found at tbligroup.com. This webinar is brought to you by TBLI Foundation, which hosts educational learning experiences dedicated to a better planet. Through the foundation, we build sustainable communities by sharing the people and the experiences making a difference to so many of our lives around the world. Our weekly podcasts bring impact thought leaders that are doing and not only chatting. Now, let me introduce my guest today. Good afternoon from our studio in Amsterdam. So for those of you who are not familiar with this platform, because we use on Run the World, if you have any comments or you want to say something, just type it in the chat area, and you'll be able to also follow up with everyone in here through the TBLI circle. So again, excuse me, thank you so much. And I'm thrilled today because she is really busy in the last 2 days, running from one session another at the UN Water Summit. So I'm really grateful that Paula Caballero, who has been actually instrumental in creating the UN SDGs, among many, many other things. So I'm not going to give that whole introduction. I'd prefer that she tells her story. I'm sure there's lots of things that she's been involved in. When I look at her CV, it's incredibly impressive. So Paula, thank you so much for doing this. The floor is yours. Tell us your journey as now you're with the Nature Conservancy, but where you started in the sustainability space. And I'll go on mute.
Hi, good afternoon to everybody. Good morning and good evening, as I'm sure there's viewers from different corners of the world. And thank you very much, Robert, for inviting me to share this space. I am joining you from New York from World Water Week. So this conversation about the SDGs is, I think, particularly timely because the kind of water crisis that the world is facing needs the SDGs and an approach like the SDGs. You asked me about my trajectory. I'll just stick to this century. I've been around for a while. I worked with the UN, and then where I managed a big portfolio around areas of sustainable development. I joined the Colombian government. I am a national of Colombia in 2010, and in that capacity developed what was at that moment a very crazy idea called the Sustainable Development Goals. And that was quite a journey that I'll speak to during the rest of this hour. I then joined the World Bank Group, where I established the very first global practice, an operational unit at the World Bank that focused on environment and natural resources. I was the global director of that. I then went to the World Resources Institute, a well-known think tank where I was the global director for climate change. And then I was very intrigued by the fact that all the trends are going in the wrong direction. And despite our best efforts, we really aren't being able to really shape and shift the kind of transformations that are needed. So I joined this small NGO that works at the crossroads of behavior change and sustainable development to try to understand what it is that makes these strange creatures known as humans tick. I have now joined TNC, the Nature Conservancy. It's the largest environmental NGO in the world. And I run the Latin America program from Mexico to Chile. And I joined TNC because it's very action-oriented. And again, it works despite its name focusing on conservation. It really is about sustainable development. And we're doing very exciting work in my region, for example, on agriculture, working with agribusiness, indigenous people, the entire suite of stakeholders that need to come to the table to put in place the kind of shifts that are needed. So that's just sort of, Robert, by way of answering your first question about my trajectory and where I am right now. And if you want, I can then talk more about what this lecture or this session is about, which is really the SDG journey.
Yeah, if you could just briefly, because I mean, the US SDGs came out of nowhere and became such a big deal, which is unusual, trying to get, and lots of investors and financial asset owners are claiming that we're committed to the UN SDGs. They're not always committed, but at least they say they are. How did that happen so quickly?
Well, when I was in the weeds, it didn't feel like it happened quickly at all. In 2010, when I joined the Colombian government, the UN Earth Summit, 20 years after, what was called Rio Plus 20, was coming up. And I saw that as a historical opportunity to really help shape and come to the kinds of metrics or agreements that we needed to bring about the shifts that are needed. It was a really historic opportunity. And when I dug in, I realized that it was just more UN speak within the bubble, talking about things like, I don't know, the infrastructure for UN environment, or concepts that nobody really understood, but created a lot of tension, like something called the green economy. And I thought, what has worked? What has worked in the past? And the shining light was the Millennium Development Goals. For all of their shortfalls, and there's many, and I can briefly touch on that, it was a shared metric. And what was incredible was how galvanizing it was. You had philanthropies, you have private sector, you had governments really stepping up and adopting these targets as their own. And it drove an incredible agenda, for example, around global vaccination. So, what you measure matters, and metrics matter enormously. And the insight I had was that we should try to get an agreement, but a real agreement, because the Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs, were cooked up in an office at the UN, sort of after the thought. And after the thought, they brought in something, one goal that was presumably on environment, but it wasn't. But it said nothing about environment. It said nothing about energy. It said nothing about infrastructure or trade or competitiveness or agriculture, or all of the many areas that actually drive development. So we put forward this idea, the Colombian government did, and we were laughed out of the room. It was considered the most absurd thing that had happened. The UN felt that, the delegates and governments, that the agenda was locked in, that what was being proposed was completely unrealistic, that it made completely no sense, and that I was just sort of this newcomer that didn't understand negotiations or really what the summit, the Rio Plus 20 summit, was already about. And I began with the support of my government, of President Juan Manuel Santos, his Minister of Foreign Affairs, and my direct boss, Patti Londoño, was the Minister of Multilateral Affairs. And I was blessed with the fact that from the very minute the idea came out, they said, this is it, this is what Colombia is going to push for. And it was unique because around the world, there was, as I say, just incredible opposition. And the opposition was because it represented a paradigm shift. So I would say the very first lesson from all of this, Robert, is that if you have an idea, if you have a concept, you're trying to push for something, and there's massive opposition, then you know that you're absolutely on the right track, because you are trying to be disruptive and you are shifting deeply, which is what we need today. So let me tell you why they were so important. They were, as I say, not inevitable. If the UN and all the established processes had been allowed to continue their own sort of meandering path, we would have ended up with what I called MDG plus. And these were the 7 goals, it was really 7, that had very noble objectives like ending hunger and ending poverty. And by 2015, which was their end date, we would have not met them. So we would have rolled them over and made them slightly more ambitious, or expanded the number of people or the percentage. And we would be right back where we started. And where are we? In a world that is completely siloed, that old vision is completely siloed, and there's social and economic, which are important, and then something called environment, which is optional and sort of up to the side. And it was a bifurcated world. It was a world where you had developed countries that had it all right. They figured it out. They had nothing to do no development problems whatsoever. I was actually informed of this many times. And then developing countries, which were the problem, and the ones that had to implement everything. And the only thing that developed countries had to do was encompassed in a nice little goal, talking about, partnerships and maybe some kind of support. I'm being a little bit facetious, but that was really what the world looked like. And what this agenda came to say was, one, everything is integrated. There are no silos, there are no pillars, there are only dimensions. And I'm proud that at the end of the journey, after many years, people were actually talking about dimensions and not pillars. And that matters, language matters. So there was a sense that everything is integrated. And that means that these sort of so-called environmental issues, like water, for example, and I'm here at the Water Week, water is an environmental issue and water is renewable, right? Well, look at what's happening with the drought in Europe right now. You tell me how environmental that is, how optional it is, and how renewable it is. Turns out it's not. But that shift was not happening. And so that movement to a universal agenda, to saying, yes, there are a spectrum of development problems, and countries will be situated in different places along that spectrum, but everybody, every country faces different development challenges, and we face huge problems with global public goods, whether this is climate change, whether these are trade flows. I mean, we live it every day. The pandemic every day brings closer and more cogently forward this understanding of how interrelated we are. So, but that was anathema to the way the UN and everything had been set up, bilateral aid. There was just a sense of developing. So breaking that was also a paradigm shift. And the fact that it was comprehensive, that it wasn't just siloed into what we're seeing as these, what I saw as very minimal outcomes, like end hunger and poverty, without really understanding what it takes. So just to give you the sense of hunger, what we were saying was, you can't have a goal to end hunger. You have to have a goal that talks about food systems and putting in place everything you need so that people can access adequate, nutritious, predictable food constantly. That sense of the security of access to nutritional and to adequate food was completely missing when you just talk about hunger or when you talk about poverty. How can you eradicate poverty if you're not talking about education, if you're not talking about women, if you're not talking about competitiveness, lifelong training, etc. So health, how can you talk about ending poverty if you're not talking about health? And the MDGs only identified a few contagious diseases, when really the greatest growing burden is not contagious diseases, right? So on and on, I could go, but the point is that this was not a given. This was a huge revolution. It was a huge fight. And the opposition was enormous from many government agencies, from philanthropies, from some UN agencies. Widely, it was derided, and it was considered a not realistic and absolutely not viable agenda. And what was interesting is that it is actually private sector and civil society that helped get it over the hurdle, if you will. The book I wrote tells the story of 2011, when we were positioning this completely crazy idea, getting accepted, getting it into the negotiations so that it could be a part of what was decided at the level of heads of state in Rio Plus 20. So that was, and then the first half of 2012, which were the actual negotiations, which culminated in June in Rio, where the SDGs became a concept that was adopted. What I can add for you, because I think there's a lot of really good lessons here, is that just as important as persevering and, in the face of opposition, just being ever more encouraged, is the fact that I knew very well the UN, and I knew that if we agreed on a concept, it would mean nothing. We would end Rio, and it was Rio Plus 20 years after the Earth Summit. I always talked about what happened in Rio Plus 1. What about the day after Rio? What was going to happen? And I knew nothing would happen because it was just a concept. So I fought very hard with a whole group of what I used to call the secret friends of the SDGs. And I have to say the Netherlands played a huge role in that. I still have dear friends in the Dutch government, and the Dutch, together with Norway, helped fund a lot of the initiatives and a lot of the roundtables and a lot of the consultations that we carried out. But with the support of the Netherlands and many other governments, we were really pushing to create a radical new kind of body within the UN that would negotiate the SDGs. And that eventually became known as the Open Working Group. It was revolutionary because it was science-based, Governments were there in their independent capacity. We broke the back of this idea of having the European Union negotiating with the developing country forum, which is called the G77, and China. And these are locked in very political positions. We broke with that, and we created a technical group where governments were sitting at the table and where they were invited to bring their experts from capital. So it wasn't diplomats not negotiating diplo speak. And, the co-chairs did a brilliant job, but that was also a really important outcome of that Rio Plus 20, was that we created the pathway, we created the tools and the mechanisms to make that disruption that was implicit in the SDGs happen, because otherwise it wouldn't have happened. So I think for private sector and for civil society, for those who are listening today, I would say that it's really, really important that you think about how to make things actionable, how you step up, how you create those pathways for that kind of transformation that is really needed. So I don't know if that provides a good answer, Robert, to your question.
Well, no, it does, because everybody sees the end product, and now everybody, where I'm connected to the SDGs, I'm doing 1 to 7, and we're really focused on that. I know even one very big private equity fund that actually analyzed all of their investments according to the SDGs. They were meaningless, but at least they went through the process until I told them, you're claiming things that are ridiculous, and then took down that thing from their website. So it was important. It was important to the financial sector that we're part of that. Let's get into what the title of this talk about redefining development. What does it take? There's no shortage of money, and despite the fact that Credit Suisse went bankrupt, they published a report every year about how much wealth is there in the world. And in their last report, they said there was 4.6 times more wealth than there is GDP. So there's lots of cash. And why is it that it's still a struggle to get the money for development?
That's what is it, 4-point-something trillion question? Yes. Well, as I was saying at the beginning, the private sector played a really, really huge role in making the SDGs happen. I would meet constantly with different representatives and trade groups who were saying, this that's happening at the UN is very exciting for us because it makes sense. We can translate it into our business models. And although as you say, sometimes there's a lot of back slapping and sensing that we're doing things and they're not happening. At least it's something that is relevant and actionable. Those are two of my favorite words in life, relevant and actionable for private sector. I think there's various reasons why we're not getting to where we need to be. And the book was called Redefining Development because of what I was saying. It created a sense that development was not something for developing countries, that it really was for all of us. And when you see the rise of populism, when you see all of right now what's happening in the streets of Paris, you can go around the world and you see that in all countries along the spectrum, as I said earlier, there's different challenges. So that was one element of the redefinition. The other one was that integration, the sense that there's no silos, that there are these dimensions and they have to come together. And another aspect was a call that we think of this in the long term, that we start to understand that we cannot have these quick fixes to develop, to define things, and that somehow it's going to happen. I think at the heart of the SDGs is a very simple equation that I would put forward to you, which is a way of understanding why the SDGs are useful and why they're also not being implemented. And that is that, to me, the basic definition of sustainability is that it is any effort, initiative, investment, what have you, that seeks to, in the best world, optimize and reinforce the growth of the three capitals: environmental, social, and economic. And at a minimum, does not grow one capital at the expense of the others. And that's a really simple equation, but it's a very difficult equation to implement if you look at it from a short-term understanding of where benefits accrue, what kind of revenue you're looking at. And I think for private sector, as well as for governments, it's very hard because private sector is trying to usually look at short-term revenues. They need to respond to their shareholders, Government is looking at political cycles. So everything we do is around these very, very short cycles. And the kind of solutions we need to put in place are much longer. So what really riles me right now is when people say that there's 7 years until 2030 or so many years until 2050. And the answer is there isn't. It's not until 2030 is right now. It is this second. It is when we make the decisions, we make the investments, we put out the policies, the omissions that define where we will end up. Think of the now as sort of a vector. And, it's very simple. If you're here and you end up here, you go in one direction or in completely different directions. And that sense of the now is, I think, that deceptiveness of the short-termism that assails government and in many cases private sector, really looking at that short-term win and not really thinking about that long-term trajectory, where we need to be and the backcasting that we need to do. And in the absence of that, we just muddle through, nudging and tweaking our own pathways where we are right now, the ways, the business models that we're comfortable with, the policy and the legal frameworks that we're comfortable with, and we are not willing to push for and to undertake the disruption that is needed to really shift all of these systems, the food systems, the energy systems, water, into a completely new paradigm that is able to grow those three capitals together with a long-term vision. I think in a way, private sector is ahead of government because private sector is thinking more with a long-term vision. Many companies are looking at long-term investments and are really looking at the long-term health of their supply chains. But even so, oftentimes, particularly, for example, for the finance sector, the return on short-term investments really outweighs the kind of patient, upfront, long-term capital that is needed to fund these transitions. And so what is needed is really a systems approach where it all comes together. The markets, the finance, the policy, all of these enabling conditions need to come together with vision and with leadership so that we are able to shift entire systems into a new trajectory. Otherwise, if we just keep nudging things, we're going to end up and continue to see the kinds of drought we're seeing in Europe right now. We're going to keep seeing the emissions trajectories. The IPCC, the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has just put out a fairly daunting new report. That window to really act on climate gets smaller and smaller, but we think we have until some date to be able to keep it under 2 degrees or 1.5. But the reality is that it's today where we decide if we're going to keep it to 1.5 or under 2 degrees, not in a pathway. And so that inertia that is built in to the current systems, to the current comfort, to the current entrenchment of those who benefit from the system as it is right now is so huge and so powerful that it is very difficult to move it. And I'm not just talking about big corporation. I'm talking about you and me. We're beholden to the system. Or if we're not, if we are those that are being left behind by the system, then we don't have enough voice and action and agency to be able to shift the system. So we continue along this inertia. We have a lot of big UN events like the ones that I'm at, or these COPs where now everybody comes to. There's a lot of announcements, but there is no real change. I would say to you, Robert, that if my mantra is 2030 is now or 2050 is now, and it truly is, if you had to choose one thing to write on your forehead, it would be that, because that is the wake-up call that we need to realize it has to be now. But one of the ways that we can help us think about that is this idea of never wasting a good crisis. And we just wasted a really big crisis, which was the pandemic. But the pandemic showed the levels of disruption that are needed and the fact that as a species, we're fairly resilient and we can bounce back. How about if we bounce into a new paradigm? Why aren't we able? Where is that leadership that is going to help us shift to a new paradigm? And I would argue that a lot of that leadership has to come from private sector. Let me tell you about a report that to me, I still see as a really important hallmark. And I shared it with you, Robert, a few minutes ago, and I hope that you can make it available from the Business and the Sustainable Development Commission. It came out in 2017. It was called Better Business, Better World. And it talked about enlightened private sector leadership. And it came up with, it just chose 4 of the SDGs: food, health, energy, and education. Some of the most popular ones are the ones that are seen to be the core drivers of economic and social issues, not just environment. And it came up with really important numbers. It said, for example, that shifting to circular models could generate opportunities of over $3 trillion by 2030. Reducing food waste could be worth over $580 billion. There's identified dozens of very disruptive business opportunities across the food, the agriculture, the energy, the urban, the health sector. But we need new business models that really reshape sustainable development. I talk about redefining development in the book and this new paradigm shift that the SDGs talk about. But now the fact is, how do we implement? How do we use that big data, for example, to unlock new business models? How do we have businesses step up and think of new social enterprise models? How can we drive sustainability across entire supply chains, whether they're international or domestic? Because in many cases, it's domestic value chains where it's more difficult to get traction and to get those shifts. So I think that when you ask me about the title of the book and how we get there and what we need to do, my answer is all of the above. Long-term vision. Don't waste the crisis that we are in. Don't think that we can get out of the crisis, the water crisis, the climate crisis, the biodiversity, and very importantly, because it's always forgotten, the equity crisis. We're living through a very, very serious equity crisis that translates into a plethora of facets, from migration to increasing rates of suicide among small farmers. The list goes on, indigenous peoples without access to land rights, et cetera, et cetera. But we cannot pretend that we can live in a world where so many stakeholders are excluded and not really an active participant, because it is simply not sustainable over the long term. So all of these crises that converge right now, my invitation is, don't waste a good crisis. Let's use the need for disruption that, for example, the drought in Europe is presenting, and really think about how we shift from an ad hoc, extractivist, short-term perspective to one of long-term thinking, of understanding where we need to be and doing the backcasting, and then having if I can put it in good Spanish, the cojones. I'm not being proper here, but the cojones, the balls to really step up and figure out what are the market tools, the finance that we need to bring together to create enabling conditions so that we can shift the trajectories of the supply chains of all these different sectors of urban development. I mean, the list, it really is the whole list of the SDGs. That's what the SDGs are about. That's what's being called for. And when I'm asked how we're doing on SDG implementation, I often say, you know what? We haven't even started. We're still implementing the old model. We're implementing water targets or energy targets or whatever targets. We're not moving towards a systems approach where everybody can benefit and grow. That is how we get continued sustainable growth, what everybody wants, in a way that is not fraud and does not leave not just people, but entire communities and entire sectors behind.
I agree with you that not wasting a crisis, because the governments who always said we have no money, all of a sudden they have lots of money to do stuff, whether it's bailing out the banks or buying vaccines or funding Ukraine. So they have the money when the pain is large enough. Unfortunately, I'm curious, how do you stay so chill? Because I don't see you really kind of getting furious. I get really furious and angry and call out people that their children are ugly, and no matter as much as they think that they're so beautiful. And I see it constantly that the big tier 1 fund managers who talk about where we've started these climate tech funds, not one of the tens of billions that went in there is investing in the fastest, quickest, most effective, longest track record way of drawing down carbon, getting people out of poverty, increasing yield, and making healthy food, which is regenerative agriculture. But it's just grabbing a shovel. There's no app. And everybody keeps chasing unicorns. They're not interested in sustainability. How do you actually get through to them in your polite manner?
Well, look, that's one of the reasons that I'm so excited about the work that I'm doing at the Nature Conservancy, because it is about working with private sector, working with the finance sector, and creating the kind of business models, the analysis that we need to be able to show to private sector and the finance sector that this is actually a good business. An example that I just used recently this morning is from Sao Paulo, which, if you'll recall, in 2014, 2015, had this incredible drought that was estimated to have cost about 1.6 billion reais. It was a big chunk of money, and it had a huge impact. The analysis that was carried out showed that if what we like to call nature-based solutions, that is, if there had been a better management, integrated management along that watershed, the drought and the financial impact of that drought would have been 28% less. We're talking millions here. So it does make business sense. We've been working with sustainable cattle ranching and regenerative agriculture. And again, we have lots of data that show that, for example, with silvopastoral systems for cattle ranching, you can grow the productivity per hectare, carrying capacity per hectare, up 3 to 5 times over 10 years with these systems that are also building back the soil, ensuring groundwater replenishment, all of the good stuff that enables that farm or that area to be able to be sustainable and resilient to climate impacts over the long term. So it actually mitigates all sorts of risks. And if you're a big company, it also mitigates reputational risks in a real way, not with greenwashing, with real investment and real numbers. So the upshot is that investing in these kinds of more sustainable or renewable pathways is good business, but you have to change the business model. In many cases, these benefits accrue over time. And if you just want the quick return, if you want to have a shiny number that's going to pop up for the next electoral cycle or for the shareholders meeting, then it becomes much more complicated. But the finance sector has a huge role to play in terms of providing that slow, patient capital for the upfront costs. The New Climate Economy also did a groundbreaking report in 2014 that showed, again, the return on investment. If you are able to invest in those upfront costs, for example, for an energy transition, the maintenance costs go down over time. And what you end up over the course of X amount of period is an enormous return on investment. But you have to measure it with that long-term vision, with that long-term perspective. And we're not doing that. Not only the finance sector isn't set up for that, but it's also not set up in the sense of like performance incentives. So I can have a really fantastic conversation with the CEO or with the head of sustainability of a big financial institution, but their managers and their agents on the ground that are actually issuing the loans to farmers have very clear performance indicators, and they've got to get money out the door under certain conditions. So what does finance sector have to do? They have to create the appetite and create the space for that patient capital. They have to have new innovative financial offers that are targeting the kind of transformation that is needed. There's a huge role to play in that. There's also a huge role for governments. Subsidies, for example, subsidies that are perverse in the sense that they do undermine that interplay of the three capitals that I was talking about. Those perverse subsidies, it's estimated that 1/3 of those subsidies, if these perverse subsidies were removed and are shifted to actually support and incentivize the right kind of investments and the right kind of actions, could address over 1/3 of what TNC has estimated is a biodiversity financing gap that can be up to over $800 billion. So the money is out there, as you're saying. But the question is, how do you change the mindsets? Goes back to why I worked with that little NGO, that small NGO that worked on this. How to change the mindset so that we understand as humans what it is, what good looks like for our species over the long term, and not with that short-term perspective.
I've always, when we started 25 years ago trying to change the financial system so it works for all stakeholders by educating asset owners and managers, I've always focused on the more irresponsible investors and criminals, the Donald Trump type, mainly because they were very pragmatic, and they have more money, they have a better sense of humor. I always found that it was actually the so-called impact investors, or the next gen chasing the next Burning Man festival to party and show a selfie of them toasting champagne. They were actually the ones who were chatting a lot and doing very, very little, because most of the time the financial community, they're hunters. Some are pirates, but in general they're hunters. They're they're rewarded for short-term behavior. But I never found it difficult to get the behavioral change. I always found the challenge was the access. If you show them, the three things they need to see: self-interest, opportunity, money flows, they'll embrace that. And I found the mistake that the climate community made is they pushed the concept of sacrifice rather than resilience. So how do we, you deal with lots of financial institutions. They say they're interested, but speak to any emerging fund manager who tries to get money from them, they'll tell you, no, they're not interested. So what they say to you and what they do is not always the same. How do we break that?
Well, I think it goes back to making it relevant and actionable. And you don't make it relevant or actionable. And I think also, having worked as and I say it in quotation marks, environmentalist, because I really don't think there's anything. The environment is a fiction, in the sense that everything in this globalized and such degraded planet that we're living in, everything we do that is supposedly environmental has these huge environmental and social repercussions. So that's why you go back to these sense of the dimensions, and it really becomes one. But it goes back to this sense of the business model, because it helps to translate, to make it actionable and relevant. And as environmentalists, you're saying the climate push, the sacrifice. Environmentalists first showed this thing of keep the people out. We have to protect it from. And that created a very significant backlash. And then there was this sense that there's the environment, or that you have to do it for values-based. And I need you to understand why this protected area or why this endemic species is so important. And for many stakeholders, the protected area and the endemic species, unfortunately, just do not make sense. It doesn't resonate with their values. So it doesn't mean not being value-based and mission-based. My life is that, and the work TNC is mission-based. And I have such deep respect for the kind of work that this organization I have recently joined does, because it is values-based, because it is mission-driven. But that doesn't change the world. You need that fire inside of you to keep going, to wake up every morning and say, I'm going to fight the good fight today and every day of my life, right? But that's not how you get people on board. You have to meet them where they are.
Yes.
And so that's why I talk about, we can talk about productivity. We can tell you why this is good for you, where you are, as a farmer or as an investor. Why does this make sense? And we are seeing really incredible shifts. We have, for example, this innovative finance for Amazon, Cerrado, and Chaco, which are three really, really hugely important biomes. And this is an initiative with the Tropical Forest Alliance, with UNEP, with TNC. There's an IFAC, there's a whole website. I won't go into everything it does. But the idea there is to mobilize many billions of dollars, working with finance sectors and a whole range of actors along these supply chains, because it's not just the farmers. We have to work with the traders. We have to work with the slaughterhouses. We have to work along the entire supply chain to generate the kind of funding that is needed to make this transition, the upfront investments, and to help shift, or to shift production, for example, soy production, to lands that are already degraded. So you don't have to keep deforesting to meet the world's needs for everything that the land produces. So we have there's some very innovative and very powerful, good examples of the kind of partnering that we can do and are already doing with private sector and with the finance sector. And I think that's what TNC excels at, that we come to the table with very clear solutions, technical, financial, policy. We work with different stakeholders, and we are able to work to identify what is that pathway to a good outcome that all stakeholders can sign up for. If I can give you another example, we're doing remarkable work in the state of Pará in the Amazon. 40% of deforestation is concentrated there in Brazil. And we're working very closely with the government of Pará, with the state government, which is like, by the way, where likely COP30 is going to be held. We work very closely with them. We're working with all of the different stakeholders. We work very closely with indigenous organizations and communities. We're supporting their efforts, have set up their own financial mechanism, the Podali Fund, so creating this whole ecosystem of funding for different stakeholders and owned and managed and run and mobilized by different stakeholders. We've been working for decades, or 35 years in Brazil, so we've helped put in place these very deep and ground-shifting policy plays. And we're working now with the markets. So you have that finance, the policy, finance at all levels, finance, policy, markets, working with indigenous people, smallholders, large holders, slaughterhouses, traders, state government, now with the national government. And then you start to really see how you put in place this massive shift of a system. Donors, bilateral donors come to us now and say, we want to work with you. We want to be a part of this. And we've been talking for years about not having things being donor driven, and the Paris and Ghana and all these different Busan, all of these different efforts to shift how bilateral aid is provided, how development aid is provided. Well, you know what, Robert? When you have a bright, shiny example full of risks and uncertainty, but where people are really stepping up and trying to do things differently so that everybody wins, working with the needs of private sector, with what the government needs to show early wins, to working with indigenous peoples, we're on and on. When you do that, others come to you. It becomes a lighthouse with sort of proverbial moths, if I can put it that way. And then you start to generate the dynamism that you need, that yes, you can. This is how you do it. Do we have it figured out? Not at all, but we're doing it. And what I wake up in the morning is trying to figure out, how can I disrupt? How can I innovate? What needs to be done differently? Because otherwise, Robert, we're part of business as usual. And if we keep nudging business as usual through COPs or a little bit of greenwashing here or there, all these issues that you have raised, the 2030s now, we ran out of time for 1.5, but we're also running out of time to revert a lot of those systems on which our entire societies and economies depend. The water crisis, the UN report that just came out is scathing and scary. But let's not be scared. That has to be a call for action. And that's why I keep my chill and the optimism and the fight, because there is no time to sit back and if you sit back, you're part of the problem. And I don't want to be a part of the problem.
I know a lot of people are not going to be happy with what I'm going to say, but when the Ukrainian war started, as horrible as it was, I was happy because for the first time, energy was going to be priced not cheaply. And lo and behold, what happened in less than a year? A third drop in energy consumption in Europe because the price was high. And instead of, I'll put a sweater on, I'll lower that. And so people adapted, but incredibly fast. I mean, the heat pumps went through the roof. So, but that has never been addressed with water because two-thirds, three-quarters of water is used for agriculture, and farmers often don't pay what water should. So I know it's a very delicate political story to actually start charging water for what it is, but do you see any progress on that at all?
Look, I agree. It's an incredibly charged agenda, and it converges with a lot of issues around human rights, equity, access. It's very complicated. I think that for different countries, there might be different policy solutions. But what is important is that we start to value water differently, regardless of exactly what is the mechanism through which that is done. Because what we're not doing is valuing ecosystem services. And you talk about ecosystem, I always wish we could come up with sort of a sexier term for ecosystem services, because it sounds sort of techie and something that tree huggers do. And it's not. We're talking about water access so your business can run, so your thermal plant can run, because if you don't have water, the thermal plant also doesn't work. It's really quite elemental, everything that we're talking about with these ecosystem services, but we don't value them. They're not priced into our supply chains. They're not priced into consumer choices. They're not priced in. And what you point with Ukraine is what I said at the beginning: never waste a good crisis. Crises show us that you can do shifts.
Yeah.
The EU has tried. I mean, it has been at the forefront of a lot of policy shifts and efforts on climate, on so-called green economy, on many fronts. Europe has tried to be a leader, and I recognize that and I appreciate that. But at the same time, when you start to look at the footprint of Europe, which also is coming out in a recent report about, for example, what is the embedded water footprint of Europe, then things start to look differently. So the answer to you is we have to value nature and what it offers differently. We have to price in those externalities and really take them on, whether they are climate or water or biodiversity, because we also have a food crisis looming with the loss of pollinators, for example. So there's all these multiple convergent crises because we're not valuing that so-called thing out here that's called environment, because we don't understand that it is one and the same with our economic and our social drivers. So you talk about water, the fact that agriculture has the biggest water footprint. When I was negotiating the SDGs, I would always say, we could choose one target and make it whole of government. It could shift everything. And one of the examples two examples: infant mortality or infant nutrition, stunting, and water use efficiency. And if you take just one of those targets, for example, and make it whole of government, it changes how most of government has to change. But water use efficiency is something that whatever water agency, which is usually siloed away in a corner, away from the actual use and the generation and the sustainable supply of water, if you make it whole of government, you force all of government to start to shift to align with that target. If you talk about stunting, which is really that dramatic erosion of human capital, if that becomes, in many countries where stunting is at phenomenally abysmal levels, if you look at that as an economic problem with long-term implications, whole of government, then it's not a problem with getting school lunches. It really changes how government assigns priorities. So the upshot is, I would say, the SDGs, they're not a silver bullet, but they're a common language. They're a grammar that enable us all to talk about the complexities of development. And if we can make the business cases and understand why this is an actionable agenda and why it is necessary for long-term resilience, for long-term productivity, for long-term growth, for finance, for private sector, private being from a small cooperative all the way to, Unilever of the world, that it is necessary for everybody, then hopefully we will be able to, if we look in the mirror of these great crises that we have had, you mentioned Ukraine, the pandemic, the ones that are ongoing right now, if we can look in the mirror and realize the kind of disruption and shifts that are needed, maybe. I don't see it coming right now in this fractured political and polarized state that the world, that most of the politics are on, because you see the same situation globally. And that's why private sector is so hugely important. Private sector has to really wake up and lead. And by private sector, I mean also finance sector, to lead the charge and to really help drive the shifts that are needed in consumption, in production, in how we value nature.
I'm going to take a couple of questions. Erica Frank wanted to know how to redirect the philanthropic sector as well as government and business to adopt the SDG framework, or have they already done that?
Thank you. That's a really, really good question, Erica. Thank you for asking. I think the philanthropy is hugely important, and obviously, very wealthy individuals or foundations have every right in the world to decide how they allocate their resources. But I think that there's a space now for a re-education of philanthropy so that they understand that we can't just be looking to fund short-term KPIs, right? Key performance indicators, and I'll give you so much, and you have to do this. I think that there's some philanthropists right now that are really looking at providing just capital money and support so that organizations that already have a really impressive track record step up and continue to do what they are doing. And I think we need to, for philanthropy, to recognize where there's entrepreneurship, where there's innovation, where there's really deep shifts happening, and to support that without asking that you get a quarterly report on KPIs. My invitation is that, and I've told my team this, we have to start defining what are KSIs, key systems indicators. How do we shift to systems? And how do we get philanthropists to help us do that? I tell you, for example, at TNC, we have these huge projects, the EU or ICI, very, very big projects for which we're very grateful. But those are tied to specific results. And it's that unrestricted money, the philanthropic money, that is the golden vessel for bringing about the change that we need, because it is with that that we can engage with the private sector, that we can figure out what kind of policy is needed to develop that, to work with governments and with other stakeholders to do the work that you need to do sort of in the back office, if you will, to help shift the markets. Those are very complicated, complex, long-term processes. And there isn't a specific KPI that you can associate with them or a result that you can give in 6 months or in 1 year. And so philanthropy has a huge role, a massive role to play in enabling these transformations, these shifts that are needed to happen. And so I think that there is a real opportunity to work with philanthropies to help them accompany NGOs, civil society organizations that are doing their best to bring innovation and to bring about constructive disruption, if you will, to different sectors.
Ben wanted to know, how can we de-link the funding of science from big business? Following the science has brought us down the rabbit hole of the Green Revolution and many more problems related to the military, medical, industrial complex. Do you agree with that?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I think science is, when you talk about nuclear technologies, you talk about dual use, right? And it can be used for military purposes or for, energy generation or for positive purposes, to put it that way. And I think that's true of everything in science, right? It depends on how you use it, but we're a science-based organization. And the breakthrough of the SDGs was that they were based on science. Those targets that some have said are not as sharp as they might be if they had been developed by a group of experts, were the product of the most complex negotiation in the world and look and smell like targets. You can tweak them but you can work with them. They are targets that you can actually line up policies or business plans to. And that's because they were based on science. So science is absolute, particularly now that we're in this age of fake news and all of this other distortions of reality, if you will. Science becomes more important than ever. And yes, science generated the Green Revolution, but science is also now showing us how, for example, through regenerative agriculture, we can build back the soils and build back the productivity and work with pollinators in ways that are viable. And we need science and technology to help us figure out how to take it to scale so that we go from these niche solutions that can be implemented in very small numbers of hectares to broad scale solutions that can work for agribusiness in sustainable ways. And the problem isn't the science. The problem is the will, the intent, the incentives that are lined up and what you're looking at. If what you're using the science for is to drive those short-term objectives, you're going to just pump more fertilizers in and use the science to figure out how to do that. Or you can use the science to do the opposite, to have that long-term continued growth. So science still has to be front and center to the work that we do, I think.
What can this audience that is listening live and those, most of them will watch the replay, what can they do to help you?
Well, not me, us. It takes a village. This is really all of us. I think it's to wake up every morning and to really ask yourselves how we see the problem and whether we're a part of the problem and what we're doing and how we're willing to change. Because the lesson of the SDGs, and if you read the book, you'll see that it was this crazy far-fetched idea that two women from a nondescript, middle-income country put forward that was widely derided, and that would have been the end of it. But we persevered. We eschewed and ignored all the normal formal channels, and we started to build up a movement that carried the SDGs forward. But when I talk about the movement, I would spend days sitting at tables in the coffee space within the UN, trying to grab one or two people to tell them what I was thinking about. That's how it started, really, really small. And I had opposition, I don't want to name them, but very big philanthropists and very important people were adamantly against this to the bitter end. There's a cliffhanger at the end of the book of what happened in Rio, of a huge government, of how the UK government tried to derail, not the UK government, Cameron tried to derail the SDGs when his government had been our greatest ally in this. So it's the story of impossibility. The book ends with a quotation from Mandela that I want to share with you. And that is the answer I would give Ben. It's impossible, full stop, until it happens. Right. And that has to be our rallying cry. It is impossible. Figure out what is the impossibility that you need to do in the sector, in your walk of life, whether it's as a parent, as a voter, as a consumer, and live for it, but persevere. Persevere with that long-term perspective in mind. Overcome the desire for short-term wins and for seeing immediate results, and figure out what you do. What is the impossibility that you're going to carry out for years, for the rest of your life? That's what I signed up for the rest of my life. Do the impossible.
We'll be sending out to all of those who might have registered with Run the World the link to the replay, and also I'll send them the report and the book that you wrote. That's available, I guess, on Amazon
yeah.
Okay.
It's available on Amazon and also with the publisher, Lynn Reiner Publishers.
Okay, well, I'll add that to there. Anyone who signed up, you can access everyone in the TBLI circle just by, sending a private chat to anyone if you need to follow up with anyone. And you can do that here by clicking on the number of participants, and then there's 3 dots to the right side. You can see their profile and you can reach out to them. Paula, I'm really very, very grateful because I know how busy you are doing all of these sessions at the UN and finding time to squeeze us in here. So I'm really extremely grateful, and I'll send you a link of the replay. And if you want a copy of the replay for TNC, I'll send that also to you. And again, anything that we can do to help you, please don't hesitate to ask. I admire your perseverance and, that you're taking the farming approach, that this is not hunting, it's a farming approach. And you're grabbing the shovel and, you're digging the hole and rolling the stone up the hill, because everybody seems to want instantaneous success. And they keep asking, what's the secret? There's no secret. You just keep on going on and doing this every day. And some days you get through, some days you don't. You start again the next day. But we are running out of time. I agree with you there. I'm not that, I've pretty much convinced myself that it'll be more about adaptation rather than mitigation.
We need both.
Yeah.
We need both. But thank you for having me. It's great to be able to reach a different audience with this rallying cry of SDG implementation. And if you or anybody's interested in how we're actually trying to make it come to reality in Latin America with the work that the Nature Conservancy is doing, I would be delighted. There's a lot of really inspiring work that we're doing. And I think that we need those lighthouses of innovation and inspiration to help us keep going. Okay. And of course, the book will remind us of why we need to implement them differently to live up to that paradigm shift that is at the heart of the SDGs and of the climate agenda.
Yeah, and as I said, now Paula is also part of the TBLI Circle group, so you can send private chats to her, but she's also quite accessible on LinkedIn, so we'll send you some contact information. Paula, thank you so much.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you so much for all of the heavy lifting that you've done, because, I mean, you don't really cut a lot of ribbons. I don't see you cutting lots of ribbons. You know, I see lots of other people cutting ribbon for the SDGs, but you were the one that kind of moved it up the hill, and others saw that you were right. So thank you for sticking with that and doing the heavy lifting, because I know it's not easy.
Thank you, Robert. May we all continue to do heavy lifting and the impossible.
Okay. You stay well. Thank you again.
You too. Thank you. Thanks to everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.